6 from good afternoon, radar contact, climb requested altitude, remain tower assigned heading.
Okay, 2,500 at nav, tower assigned heading for 006.
The new DC-1X from David Clark, with a sleek, surround-the-ear design, brings a new level of quiet, comfort, and performance to general aviation pilots.
It's a very comfortable headset to wear over a long period of time.
The DC-1X is backed by a 5-year warranty, extraordinary David Clark customer service, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. So you'll feel just as comfortable owning the DC-1X as you will flying with it.
Oh, plan land 006.
The DC-1X. It's the one for you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 56th broadcast of NAFI MentorLIVE. MentorLIVE is a program brought to you by the National Association of Flight Instructors, and we're pleased that it's open to all pilots. NAFI MentorLIVE is broadcast the third Wednesday of every month, and we're happy for you to join us this evening. I'm Paul Pradecker. I'm the president of NAFI, but I'm also the host for tonight, and I welcome all of you to this program. We're very excited to have the David Clark Company as our sponsor for this evening. So many of you know about David Clark and have used their hearing protection equipment. David Clark started making passive headsets in 1975, and of course now they also have a wide range of electronic noise attenuating headsets. But I wonder how many of you know that the David Clark Company has also been involved in the aerospace industry in producing some of the G suits and pressure suits used in the X-plane series, as well as the space program, starting in about the early 1940s. So once again, thanks to them for their sponsorship of this program. And they'll be at the EAA convention, of course, in booth 3092. So if you happen to be there, stop by and say hi and thank them for sponsoring this event. Tonight's program is brought to you by John and Martha King, also well known in the industry as colleagues and friends. The Learjet tragedy at Gillespie Field. What went wrong? Before we get into it, you're able to earn wings credit. And if you just follow the path on this page and click, you can apply for wings credit after taking the quiz. Of course, if you're not a member of NAFI, we would certainly love for you to join, so we're able to bring these programs to you again. If you care to make a donation, you can do so through the Educational Foundation. John and Martha King, of course, are no strangers to the industry, as I said before. They're colleagues and friends to so many of us. There's not enough space on a PowerPoint to talk about everything they've done. I think the most important thing is to know that they have helped pilots achieve their dream of flying for more than 40 years, in addition to so many other things they've done. So, John and Martha, I know that you frequently start a presentation, especially when you're doing the live presentations. I've seen you at EAA doing presentations, and you so often start the presentation by asking for a show of hands, asking people if they have known someone who has been killed in a crash. And the number of hands that go up is always a large percentage of the audience. So I want our viewers to know, out of just self-disclosure and just so that everybody understands, that if you were to ask me this question tonight, I would raise my hand, because in this very case, I was a contract pilot for this operator from January of 2000 until January of 2020 until January of 2021. I flew the very airplane in the event, and I flew with the crew members on a number of occasions. We just want everybody to understand that this accident is under investigation. We will answer some of your questions. However, we're not going to speculate on anything. What we're really here to do is to support John and Martha in their presentation about risk management. So John and Martha, you've got the flight controls. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, hello, fellow pilots and flight instructors. In case there's any confusion about this, I'm John King.
And I'm Martha King.
Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to follow up on what Paul was saying by saying that we also have a personal connection to this accident because while our airplane lives at a different airport in San Diego, we flew into Gillespie Field on a regular basis to have our airplane maintained. And so we're very familiar with the airport and the approaches to it. We did not know the operator, we did not know the pilots, but we do know the airport.
It's a difficult airport. It's got steep approaches. It's surrounded by high terrain. We have never ever gone into the airport at night because it's just really difficult, and don't want to accept that risk. We've gone into it in some IFR approaches, but it's a difficult airport, and these pilots faced a lot of risk factors, and it's just a risky airport. It's really tough. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. One of the things we want to talk about tonight is that this is a great opportunity for flight instructors to get practice on how they're going to teach risk management to their students. And so we're going to work on that. And we're going to we're going to look at this scenario and use the PAVE checklist to try and identify the risk factors. Now, what happened in this particular case, this was a Lear 35 that wound up circling in low ceilings and low visibility at night. And they were returning to their base after a patient transport. They hit the ground and killed both pilots and 2 nurses. And it was absolutely a tragedy. And you'll feel that way when we're done with this. It's really a bummer to see this happen. Martha, go ahead.
So, one of the things that we know is that there's no way for flight crews, for pilots to eliminate all the risks in aviation. But events like this crash really heighten the urgency that we all feel, particularly as instructors, to manage those risks and to teach our learning pilots as best we can how to manage the risk. Because managing the risks is really the primary responsibility of the flight crew, and that's what their focus really needs to be. And it's this was a terrible outcome. And as Paul said, the NTSB is still investigating, and we're not going to try and second guess them, but we're going to talk about some elements in the scenario that are teaching moments for you with your students. So, um,
It all has to do with risk management, and what we're going to play next is the tape of the air traffic control of the pilots talking to air traffic control. And I'll have to tell you, this tape is a very disturbing tape because you're gonna hear the last words of this crew and their passengers, and it was a very very disturbing thing. So I apologize for you hearing this. It was played. It was the tape with the pilot, apparently the captain talking to ATC. And so let's go ahead and listen to this tape because it sets the scenario for this accident. So let's talk about that tape and let's listen to that scenario.
And Gillespie Tower, is there 880 Zulu is with you on the GPS. I'll set up some position. What is that? Learjet 880 Zulu, Gillespie Tower, wind 190 at 5, runway 17, clear to land. Runway 17, clear to land, 880. And the airport inside, we'd like to squawk PFR for 880 Zulu. Learjet 80 Zulu, roger, runway 17, clear to land. Now we'd like to take runway 27, 880 Zulu. Learjet 80 Zulu, understand you're canceling IFR? Yes, sir. Learjet 80 Zulu, IFR cancellation received. You can overfly the field, make left traffic runway 27 right to runway 27 right, clear to land. Change to runway 27 right, clear to land. Clear 27 right, clear to land, 880 Zulu. And can you drop the lights for us a little bit more? They're at 100% now. Oh, shit! Oh, shit! Oh, shit! Pulse 15 to Gillespie, ground. Pulse 15, call the tower, please. Pulse 15.
Wow, that is very very disturbing, and I'm sorry that you folks had to listen to that. It's just it just tells you the seriousness of this tragedy, and I'm sorry you had to listen to it. It's very difficult to listen to. Now let's describe what happened here. The pilots were coming in from the north and making an approach to RNAV approach to runway 17.
The airport's down here. This is the runway 17 that the approach was for.
And this is the NTSB Aviation Accident Preliminary Report, and if it will help us all as we go through this, if we remember that this airport elevation is very close to 400 feet. It's 388 feet MSL, but if you keep it in your mind that it's nearly 400 feet, it'll help us keep track of the altitudes of the airplane as it goes around here. So we'll start off. The airplane is coming in from the north, and the pilot got visual and descended down to 1,000 feet MSL and reported the airport in sight, and said they would like to squawk VFR, which I'm sure it might have been a little bit confusing to air traffic control. Essentially, what they were doing was trying to cancel IFR, and they wanted to squawk VFR. So therefore, to make it clear, they're canceling IFR. And ATC then cleared the pilot to land on runway 17, and then they said, we don't want to land on runway 17. We want to circle and land on runway 27. And the reason they wanted to cancel IFR is that the approach plate says that circling on 27 and 35 is not authorized
At night.
at night. And so they wanted to cancel IFR so that they could circle. Now, let's talk just a little bit about what canceling IFR did for them. It put them in a mind frame that they didn't have
Could
to.
have put them in.
It could have. We don't know what they did, but it could have put them in a mind frame where they didn't feel that they had to maintain the minimum altitude for circling. The minimum altitude for circling, if you look at this for
Category
C and D aircraft, was about 1,052 feet or about 1,100 feet above the airport elevation. So but they continued down, and apparently under the idea that they didn't have to maintain the IFR circling altitude, and because they were VFR, and they continued on down to lower altitudes. At this point, that they were now about 775 feet MSL, which is about see, are you showing that? You are about 300 feet above the airport elevation, which is pretty doggone low. And so they circled, and
A relevant item here is that the pilot asked the tower controller, to turn up the lights, and the tower confirmed that the lights were already at 100% brightness. And as best we can figure out, it looks like they were about 1.5 miles or 2 miles maybe from the runway threshold on 17 when they asked for the lights to be turned up.
and they were at an altitude of 325 feet, 375 feet above the airport when they're asking the lights to be turned up. So they're pretty low, and they're having trouble seeing, so they're asking the lights to be turned up. And ATC says, well, they're already up.
So they continued on, and they came over the airport. The tower had cleared them for the circle to runway 27 right, because the tower doesn't enforce any approach plate notes or anything like that. It's up to the pilot in command, of course. So they're coming around. I'm sorry, somehow I keep changing the screen. Okay, so they're coming around on the circle, and right down here, they're at about 700 feet MSL, which is
300 feet AGL.
right. And over here, they've gotten starting to climb a little bit up to 875 MSL, and over here they're up to 950 MSL, but that's still not terribly high. And the airport, let me show, the airport runway is right over here.
Okay.
So at this point right here, they are basically intercepting the final for runway 27 right, but they're still pointed north.
Now they are pointed right at a mountain there, Rattlesnake Mountain, which is ahead of them. It would be very impressive out their windshield.
On a clear VFR day, this is what they would have seen as they were circling. This was the view from 850 feet MSL, which would, as they were finishing the round out on the circle. This upper one is their view from 950 feet if the weather had been clear. And right up here, this is Rattlesnake Mountain, and there's a tower on the top of it that goes up to 1,200 and some feet. And they're at that moment at about 950, and this was their home base. They flew in here a lot. They would be aware that that mountain was there if they overshot the final.
Now, if they're going to miss that mountain, what they're going to have to do is bank and turn on final for runway 27 right.
This upper left photo shows what the runway would have looked like on a clear day. There's the runway right there, and the crash site is right over here.
So they were in an extremely low situation with low ceilings and low visibilities, and
At night.
and a situation in order to miss Rattlesnake Mountain and to get lined up with the runway, they needed to do a hard bank, and the hard bank and a steep turn, probably with some G forces on them, with some acceleration forces.
Now, we don't know whether they exactly why they ended up crashing, whether they hit something, whether they did a stall spin. The NTSB is investigating, and there's a lot of stuff they're going to be looking at.
There's a lot that we don't know yet, and no one really knows yet because all the facts haven't come out yet. But let's talk about the risk categories they faced. And to do that, we put the risks into the PAVE tool, and PAVE stands for the risks associated with pilots, aircraft, the environment, and the external pressures on the pilots. So we're going to put these risks into those categories. And
Now, the pilots may well have done this also, but we're going to look at some things in the different categories that can help stimulate your thinking as instructors for working with your learning pilots and helping them think about situations like this.
And we don't know whether the pilots went through this exact same scenario that we're talking about right now and analyzing. So let's take a look at it. The P stands for the pilot. So let's talk about the risk factors associated with the pilot and pilots, the crew. And one could be the fatigue and crew condition of the crew. They were on a same day transfer. They started out, we think, at the home base and then went to Lake Havasu City, picked up a patient, and took the patient to Santa Ana, and now they're on a flight leg back to returning to home
Now,
base.
Lake Havasu City is on the Colorado River. Orange County is on the coast, so that's probably a maximum of maybe 150 miles.
Yeah, and so the crew could have had some fatigue because they started out in the morning before going to the river, the Colorado River, which is in between Arizona and California. So, and they're on a repositioning flight, repositioning back to home base from Santa Ana to Gillespie. And we have no other details available about how fatigued the crew may or may not have been, but that's what
We
they
don't know
went
what
through.
their schedule was before this particular flight. We just don't know.
The other risk factors associated with the crew is time and type and proficiency in type, and how recently they've been through proficiency training, and how also we don't know how well they work together as a crew. And these are all things that whether their crew resource management was sharp and how well they were doing with each other on that. And so these are the factors you think about when you think about the pilot. Recency of experience and time and type are, of course, two of those things. And so
again, for this particular incident, we don't know anything about what happened. I mean, what that background is. The A stands for the aircraft.
wait, let's not go to the aircraft yet.
Okay.
All right, let's go back where we were. I lost my place there. So anyway, all of these factors associated with the crew would reflect on their ability to circle the airplane at night and their crew coordination's ability to make that happen safely. So it's a difficult circling maneuver and in poor weather at night. And so in order to do that, these crew factors come into play. And so we don't have any answers, but we do know those are the questions to ask. And the point of this is to ask questions, not to try and answer them. right now. We don't know the answers. So let's go. You want to go to the next slide? Let's go
Right.
ahead to the next
This
slide.
is the aircraft was a Lear 35A, and with it, in any situation, a pilot always wants to think about what are the capabilities of their particular aircraft.
And what we're now doing is segueing into to considering the risks associated with the aircraft. So we did the pilots, now we're the aircraft, and the Lear 35A has some characteristics that make it difficult to fly some approaches and to circle. It doesn't fly slow well. The matter of fact, the FAA's aircraft characteristics database says the approach speed of the Lear 35 is 143 knots. And for an IFR approach standpoint, that puts it in the category D. And so that limits the number of airports that you can fly into. Also, the Lear 35 A has an abrupt stall, and it stalls abruptly and deeply. And so this is not an ideal aircraft to be circling at low altitudes and at slow speeds. Um, it's a a fast aircraft, has a fast approach speed and stalls abruptly and deeply. So it's not the ideal aircraft to go out and fly around in low ceilings, low visibility at night and to maneuver. It's a difficult aircraft. It's a high performance aircraft, and it takes a sharp crew to fly it well.
And again, when you're talking with learning pilots, that um, have them think about what are the characteristics of their airplane that they're going to be flying on instrument approaches and possibly circling, and on the approach at the end of it, and we'll talk more about that later. But what are the characteristics, and are they favorable or unfavorable, and how do they load the risk management equation, if you want to say that?
Now, V stands in this PAVE checklist stands for environment and the environment, and the factors associated with the environment in this particular trip is it was an extremely short trip, only 68 nautical miles. You would be about 18 minutes in the air. That's very little time to get set up for an approach, even if you had completed a very thorough briefing beforehand. And so, getting set up and getting organized is key to it, and there wasn't a lot of time here. So the environment didn't help in that standpoint. Nighttime, of course, is a factor, and that's a very, very difficult factor. Rain, low ceilings, low visibilities, which were unusual for this area, were a factor as well. And then,
Normally, what we have in Southern California and what instrument pilots are used to here as the usual is a low stratus layer of 1,500, 2,000 feet, a stable air situation where uh, you've got a nice flat bottom on the cloud layer, and you don't have much variability there. So whatever margin you have under those clouds is pretty stable and pretty certain. That's the usual situation. In this case, we had a front going through the area, and it brought rain and ragged ceilings and low visibilities.
now, one of the things that this airport makes difficult is that there's high terrain north and east of the airport. And if you approach it from the east, you have to make a very steep approach to the airport. And that makes this airport a difficult airport to fly into.
Another thing in regard to the environment, of course, is the weather. This crash happened at 1914 local, 7:14 local, and sunset was at 4:51 local. So it was quite a bit after sunset. It would have been full dark. The reported weather, the METAR at Gillespie Field at 18:55, which was about 20 minutes before the crash. The wind was variable at 5, so that wouldn't make any difference as far as runway choice. The visibility was 3 miles, which was the minimum that the approaches in category C and D required. The visibility was, the clouds were 2,000 feet broken, and
Yeah.
the temperature dew point spread was 2 degrees.
Now, I want to emphasize that this is the reported visibility of 3 miles. and it
And
was
the reported ceiling.
and both before and after the crash, the hour before and the hour after, they had 3 miles visibility reported, and 2,000 feet broken before, and 1,100 feet broken afterwards. And each hour they had 2,600 overcast. So those are the reported. That's the reported weather, with in each case a 2 degree dew point, temperature dew point spread, and uh, and no precipitation reported either hour. However, the first responders reported heavy precipitation, and the witnesses reported dense fog at the scene of the crash. And so the important point is, it doesn't matter what the reported aircraft is. In this case, both before and
Reported
after
weather.
reported weather is the important thing is the weather you're actually having. And it's apparent that maybe they were having weather that's different than was reported before or afterwards, and they were in. Apparently, the first responders reported heavy precipitation, so maybe their weather was different than reported. It doesn't look that bad. It's 3 miles visibility and either 2,000 feet or 1,100 feet broken, so it looks like VFR weather, but it doesn't look like they actually flew in VFR weather.
It doesn't look like the weather they got is the weather that was being reported. So um, let's look at the possible options that this crew would have had going into for that flight going into Gillespie. There were 3 instrument approaches at Gillespie, an RNAV to 17, which is what they flew. We're going to look at each one of these in a little bit more detail in just a minute. An RNAV to runway 9 left, and a localizer Delta, which lined up with runway 27, but wasn't able to have straight in minimums, just circling minimums. At other nearby airports, Montgomery Field, MYF had an ILS, Palomar, CRQ had a ILS, and of course San Diego International had a ILS, in this case to runway 9, but again the wind was not strong enough to make much of a factor. Or another alternative, a possibility would have been would be to stay overnight at Orange County SNA and wait for better weather in the morning.
It might be difficult to make yourself stay overnight because the weather was reported VFR both the hour before and the hour after the accident. So it'd be hard to talk yourself into not making the trip.
Paul, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? I guess not. Okay. So let's take a look at those approaches. And this is the runway 17 RNAV approach. This is the approach that they flew. And as you see up here in the note, circled in red, it says that circling to runway 27 right or 35 is NA, not authorized at night. So they couldn't legally circle to that runway out of an instrument approach at night, which is why one might assume that that was the reason why they canceled IFR before they went.
If you look at this approach plate, you notice to the east there's lots of high terrain there, and that's obviously a risk factor for this particular airport because you wouldn't want to circle too far east or get yourself too far east in that high terrain.
Here's part of the reason that we think that they may have wanted to circle. If you look at the airport diagram, these 2 red circles are circling areas where we're indicating, the FAA is indicating a displaced threshold.
They're showing displaced threshold.
Right, they're
circling.
well,
Showing.
they're highlighting the
Right.
displaced threshold indications. So the displaced threshold on runway 17 meant that the usable runway for landing there, because of the displaced threshold, is just under 3,700 feet. Now, if the airplane circled to runway 27 right, even though it has a displaced threshold, they would still have almost 1,000 feet more runway. They'd have a little over 4,600 feet of runway.
So it may have been wet that evening. So these are actually short distances for Lear 35. And it probably you wouldn't want to land, and most likely on 3,695 feet of short runway that's wet. So that's why they wanted to not land on runway 17 and to go over to the 27 right, which was 1,000 feet longer. So it's a wet evening, and that adds to the problems.
Let's take a look now at the runway 9 left approach to Gillespie. And on that RNAV approach, you can't tell it from this indication unless you're really zoomed in on the airport diagram, but there's no displaced threshold if you're landing from the west on runway 9 left, and you'd have the full runway length available, 5,342 feet. The problem is that it's not available for category C and D aircraft, according to the minimum section. And we've looked at that approach, and we suspect right where the missed approach starts is very close to it. And we saw it when we saw the visual shot of where what the airplane might have seen as it was south of the runway. Is Rattlesnake Mountain, and the tower on the top of it goes up to 1,273 feet. So we're guessing, because I don't know the criteria for designing these, that this category C and D aircraft couldn't use this because the FAA didn't think they would be able to make the turn for the missed approach soon enough to be able to safely be sure of clearing Rattlesnake Mountain.
Yeah, the problem is you'd be doing your missed approach into higher terrain. And so the FAA probably wouldn't authorize that.
Another approach, the other approach at Gillespie, is the localizer delta approach. It lines up with runway 27 right, but it's not to that runway because the minimums on it leave you too high to meet the criteria for a normal descent on a straight-in landing. So it has multiple step-down fixes that you can see in the profile view here. Because of the high terrain out east here, the runway, the VASI on the runway is 4.5 degrees, too steep for straight-in minimums. And actually, if you don't see the runway until you get to the final approach fix, you've got a 6.88 degree angle of descent down to the runway. So if you really had to shoot it to minimums, what people would do is come in and see the airport too high to land, make a basically circle, make a pattern there, and come in under the clouds and land on 27 right. But again, there is a note up here at the top of the approach that says circling to runway 27 right or 35 not authorized at night. In other words, even if you came in and saw the airport at minimums, you couldn't make that traffic pattern legally and come in and land on the runway.
So what would you do?
Well, you'd make a missed approach.
Yeah, but
You could go
the only
take a
thing you can
look.
legally do to get in straight ahead is just land a
You'd have
very
to-
steep straight in approach.
Right. You would have to hope that you saw the runway from further out than the last step down fix, which is Debbie, and that you were able to land straight in. But it's going to be a pretty steep approach when you're doing that. We've done it. It's doable. It's in real weather, it would be uncomfortable. Okay, so if you're looking at trying to get into Gillespie Field, SEE, IFR at night for category C and D aircraft, your options basically are a straight in approach to runway 17, which is fairly short, just under 3,700 feet, particularly if you've got a wet runway and a jet, or fly the localizer Delta approach. Hope that you see the runway early enough that you can go ahead and descend and land straight in because you can't circle. And if you do that and you don't see the runway in time, then you do a missed approach and you're going to have to figure out something else to do. So what else could you do either before or after you shot that approach? Well, there's other nearby airports. If you just looked at a VFR sectional of that airport, of that area, San Diego area, you'd pick out 3 other airports pretty quickly that you thought might be usable, that had better approaches, but they would require that you leave the airplane and then take ground transportation back to your home airport, Gillespie, to get your cars, and then go back to wherever you landed to pick the airplane up the next day. One nearby airport is Montgomery Gibbs Executive Airport. They've got an ILS to runway 28 right. However, again, if you look in the minimum section, it's not authorized for category C or D aircraft. Now, that's unfortunate. There is actually enough runway pavement there, but for political reasons, the runway was shortened. It has a displaced threshold for landing, and after past the displaced threshold, you only have 3,400 feet, which for a Lear 35 on a rainy day would be really an interesting issue. Another nearby airport is Palomar Airport, McClellan Palomar Airport. It's got an ILS approach coming in from east to west. Part of the approach is over some pretty steep terrain, but the longer usable, but the high terrain is not close to the airport. There is a longer runway. You've got about 5,000 feet there. But if you look at the minimum section, it's not authorized for category D aircraft. So
you can see that as you become a category D aircraft, your options become very limited. And so let's take a look at if we can find an airport that they can go into easily in the category D.
Well, they could easily go into San Diego International Airport, which of course is an airline airport. It has an ILS approach with a much longer runway, of course. And the thing that would give a lot of people pause is that it has a monopoly FBO that is fairly expensive, and that's signature at that airport. So it's certainly landable at. It would be somewhat potentially expensive there. So the thinking with using an alternative airport might take in the factors of well, you have to leave the airplane overnight and come back for it. It's not positioned for the next medical flight, which medical flights don't come on a nice tidy schedule. You never know, you might get one in the middle of call in the middle of the night. And also it's a more expensive certainly than being back at your home base. So people might think twice about using that alternative airport.
It'd be a lot of falderall getting around after a long day. So it's
Right.
not something you enjoy doing.
So to sum up the environment weather risk, that moving the airplane from Orange County down to the home base of Gillespie in bad weather increased the risk. Now, that could have been avoided by staying overnight at the departure airport, but again, everybody likes to be at home. And particularly when you're that close to being home, Orange County is only about 80 miles north, no, 68 miles north of San Diego. It would be very tempting to just say, let's go ahead and get home.
So let's review the possible options. Gillespie had runway 17, but that's not really usable because it's a short runway. The runway 9 left, RNAV is not available for C and D aircraft. The localizer D approach is only straight in. You really can't circle, but you can only land there if you saw the runway in time straight in. Other airports, Montgomery is not available for C and D. Palomar is not available for D. And San Diego runway IL9 ILS is usable, or you could have remained overnight at Santa Ana and never have left. So those were your options. The options get fewer when you realize it's a Category D aircraft.
Right. The E in PAVE stands for the external, and because we're pilots, the internal pressures on us because we're goal oriented. With the and those external and internal pressures are the reason that pilots generally fail when they do fail to mitigate the other risks.
Well, pilots are used to completing what they set out to do. If you set something as a goal, it's awful hard to make yourself give up on a goal because you're an achiever by nature, and that's how you became a pilot. So that's one of the factors. We don't really know what the pressures were on the pilot. We don't know whether or not they were under any kind of pressure to get back at home. We don't know whether the pilots and nurses were pressuring each other to get back, and we don't know whether the company wanted the airplane back at the base. We don't know any of those things, but those are possible internal, external pressures that make people ignore the other risks. But we don't know how they played on that crew.
No, but they are really the major, we feel, reason why risks are not managed well. It's because we want to finish what we started out to do, and that's important to us as pilots. So managing the external and internal pressures is the primary responsibility of the pilot in command. That's what they really need to be focused on when they're doing a flight. The technical stuff, of course, is very important, but if they don't layer on managing themselves as well as the airplane, they're exposing themselves to much more risk.
Now, let's talk about some things that might show a less than ideal risk management.
And these are things that you as flight instructors can talk about with your learning pilots as examples of, you want to think about these. Are these appropriate things to do? And if so, why? And if not, what would you do instead?
So the circling to runway from runway 17 to 27 right to gain runway length took on there was a trade-off. There was a risk involved in circling, and there was a risk involved in landing straight ahead on runway 17. So there's a trade-off there. So canceling IFR to avoid a restriction against circling IFR might be a less than ideal thing to do. The canceling IFR had two things that changed the mindset of pilots. If you cancel IFR, you might feel that your restrictions about circling lower and going lower than IFR circling minimums might be removed, and so you might not maintain your altitude during the circle because you feel that you've canceled IFR and you're not restricted by the minimums of circling. The other thing is if you're have canceled IFR, you might not feel that a missed approach is available to you. But at any time when that crew was circling, they could have just turned towards the airport, climbed, and done a missed approach. They might have gotten in the clouds, and they might be technically not legal because they weren't IFR anymore, and they'd be climbing into the clouds VFR. But it'd be far better to just simply climb up and say, "Oh, folks, here I am. Give me a clearance." And much better than trying to stay VFR as the weather got worse and the ceilings and visibilities got worse. If you found one of the things the crew could have done, we'll talk about this in a minute, is that they could have taken action to prevent getting themselves into this situation. So
now here's an interesting factor that we think leads to the failure of instrument pilots to mitigate the circling risk.
Particularly jet pilots, because when you go back to current training in a jet, they have you practice circling, and you demonstrate a circle at night after an IFR approach. And we're wondering whether the circling maneuver that you're required to demonstrate on your recurrent flight training in a jet is realistic. What happens? The simulator company gives you a gouge. You go to this heading for so long, and then you turn to that heading, and you time after you passed over this intersection, and so on. And if you do it successfully in a simulator, you're following all of these very specific instructions on how to game that particular approach
On that simulator.
on that simulator. So you're coached on the timing and landmarks of that exact situation. And it may not produce competence in doing circling. It might produce instead overconfidence. And so we're wondering whether that training really does set you up for success, or does it lead you into overconfidence? So we're wondering whether the training you do in circling IFR in jets at nighttime,
Which is required by the FAA, by the way.
yeah, this is not the simulator company's fault. It's the FAA's requirement. We're wondering whether it really does minimize risk.
It kind of sets you up with a overconfident attitude. So if you're going to circle in real life, it's difficult, particularly if it's a high performance airplane, because it requires, if you're down, if you need to be down at the IFR minimum circling altitude and in the minimum visibility, because the weather is really that low, it needs a lot of crew coordination if it's a crew aircraft. It requires very good bank control and low visibility. The crew has to be able to maintain their altitude very precisely and maintain their speed very precisely. And they have a problem because in order to do that, on the one hand, you need to be watching your flight instruments very closely. And on the other hand, you need to be looking out the cockpit window to keep the airport runways in sight that you're circling to. So particularly in a single pilot operation, this gets to be a very complicated process.
Even in a crewed operation, it's a very difficult process. Some airlines don't allow their pilots to do circling approaches. And it's very difficult, very challenging, and you don't want to put yourself in that situation. So let's talk about how you could manage a satisfactory outcome doing circling. One, you can brief the risk factors in advance, and you can brief how low you're willing to go, and you'd have the second pilot not flying be prepared to be able to make call outs so that if you bust the altitude, you go too low. It's a risk factor, and you want to make sure that the crew is making call outs about it. The second thing is that you want to prepare for doing a missed approach. If brief doing a missed approach, and get both pilots in a frame of mind that if we get to the point where we're having difficulty maintaining a visual here as we're doing this circling approach at night, IFR and low ceilings and visibilities, what we need to do is be ready to do a missed approach, be ready to climb.
Be spring loaded for the missed approach.
And execute the missed approach as the approach plates require it.
And one of the traps there is that I think might have existed at Gillespie on this night, the psychological traps, is that the reported ceiling 20 minutes before the crash, which would be the weather that they had at Gillespie that they would have been working off of, said that they had a 2,000-foot ceiling. And so you expect that's what you're going to get, and you just keep coming down, possibly expecting to be able to break out of the clouds and just keep on descending without having mentally and psychologically set, if you will, a hard deck that says, okay, this is my minimum altitude. That's what the approach plate says. And if I don't see the airport when I get there, see it well enough to go ahead and land, then I'm on a missed approach, and I'll figure out where I go from there.
So the way the crew can deal with this is brief that hard deck, and if they find themselves violating the deck or at that deck, they still can't see what they need to see, then they already have briefed a missed approach. So they'd be prepared to maintain a hard deck, and prepared if they have any problems with it, maintain a do a missed approach.
The second issue is, okay, so you've come down and the clouds are above minimums and you do see the airport. So you start your circle, but the clouds don't stay above minimums. They keep coming down, and it's just kind of a natural impulse to keep the airplane just below the clouds. And sometimes you don't really realize how low you're going.
So you have someone watching that and to call it out during the circle, and also prepare and get ready for the missed approach. And the deal really is that it's not the weather at the airport; it's the weather where you are that's your problem.
Right.
And they weren't reporting the weather where they were reporting the weather at the airport. So this crew probably ran into weather that's different than was reported at the airport.
Which is
And-
not uncommon.
And so you have to be prepared to make call outs, to watch your altitude, and be prepared to miss the approach. They could have considered staying overnight at the departure airport.
Well, if we're planning for satisfactory outcome on this kind of scenario, staying
Yeah,
overnight at the
that's part of the
departure
planning.
airport is certainly an acceptable alternative, and John and I have done it a number of times. Or picking an alternative airport and going in there that has better weather, better approaches, whatever it might be.
Well, they didn't necessarily have to pick the alternative airport to go to. They could have gone to Gillespie, and then if they missed the approach, then go to an alternative
Yeah,
airport.
but
They could have gone over to Lindbergh,
But they would have
or
to
not Lindbergh, San Diego International.
but they would need to have thought about where they could legally go if that happened.
Or
So
whether legally or not, could safely go, get the airplane safely on the ground.
I think you can see that what we're basically talking about here is a lot of thinking ahead of time before you've even gotten in the airplane and started the engine, to find out, to talk through with yourself, if you're single pilot, or with your other crew member, what exactly are we going to do? Here's why this is a challenging situation. Here's what our options are. Here's what our basic minimums are going to be. And if it doesn't work out, here's what we're going to do next.
Now, there's a lot of talk about loss of control and controlled flight into terrain being the cause of accidents. And our argument is they're not the cause of accidents, they're the result of the crew getting into a situation that either the airplane or the crew can't handle. So our suggestion is don't get yourself into a situation that that the airplane or crew aren't prepared for. You got to be able to handle them. So as I was a kid going into school, the nuns used to tell me, don't get yourself in the occasion of sin. And in this case, if you have lost the control and controlled flight into terrain, maybe it's an example of having gotten yourself into an occasion of sin. You've gotten yourself in a situation that you can't handle.
So the lesson to take away from that really is that we need to look upstream for opportunities for proactive risk management to avoid getting into that situation. And I'd like to answer now a chat that I just saw pop up that asked about whether Montgomery was a realistic option for a jet. Yes, it is. We fly a Falcon 10 in and out of Montgomery. We're a Category B airplane because we have leading edge slats and a very slow approach speed. The Lear was a Category D and a lot faster, and would only have 3,400 feet of runway for landing, so not realistic really for the Lear 35. But there's a number of other jets, especially citations of various flavors, that go in and out of Montgomery all the time.
Well, just because a Falcon 10 can go into Montgomery doesn't mean a Lear can.
Exactly.
And we have the Falcon 10 has a much softer stall and a slower stall, and it just mushes rather than braking abruptly. So and it also has a 35 knots slower approach speed than the Learjet.
I think a big takeaway from this to pass on to your learning pilots is that part of what you want to do is make sure that they understand the importance of reading the notes because on an approach plate, because there's all kinds of things about you can't circle here, period. You can't circle here at night. Only category A and B can land, but not C and D. That kind of issue that shows up on the notes, or certain equipment that's required in order to do the approach. And I know it's easy to give short shrift to the notes. Sometimes it feels like there's just too much on the approach plate, but they're significant. They make a difference.
Someone else asked here, was a FRAT, flight risk assessment tool used? And I don't know. We really don't know what the crew did or didn't do, but we're not suggesting a FRAT because putting numbers to it is difficult. In the airman certification standards, people object to risk management being required in the airman certification standards because it's not subjective, and it's not objective. Trying to make it objective is kind of unrealistic. I think that it's okay for risks to be subjective. You just have to manage them and think about
Well,
them.
the important thing is the process. A process of thinking about potential risks and figuring out how to mitigate them, whether it's the pilot, the aircraft, the environment you're operating in, or managing your own external and internal pressures.
Paul, do you have any comments?
John and Martha, just to say thank you for this presentation. As I've said before, you were friends and colleagues to so many in this industry, and we appreciate very much taking the time to be part of this. As I said before, this is a close one for me. I knew the crew, I knew the airplane, and the best thing I can say is it's an opportunity to learn. And so your presentation about risk management, of course, is spot on. It's integral into the ACS. It's part of what we should be teaching. When I just think about some of the key things that were going on, the few that just stick out to me is that it was a short flight, as you pointed out. Short flights, you have the idea of, oh, it's just 20 minutes, it's just across town, or it's just from here to there. But sometimes it's the short flights that require the most attention and preparation, because just because it's a short flight doesn't mean you should shortcut all of your preparation. And what that does, of course, is compress the time, allowed to do so. The whole circle thing, we've had a couple of comments about, what was some of the decision making. All we know is that 17 was a shorter runway and not preferred at that airport, especially under wet conditions. So going to 27 right from a performance standpoint was correct. Your comments about circling, I think everybody who's been through any kind of an air carrier program has been to two different airports in the simulator. It's Memphis, doing the localizer 27, circle to land 18 right, and all of the cues that the instructors give you about how to fly that. The other one that I've done quite a lot was up at JFK, 31 to 4. Circling is it is a tough maneuver under the best of circumstances, and you mentioned in your program that some airline operators do not allow it. I would say most airline operators do not allow it. When I was doing check rides under Part 121, we had a limitation that we put on everybody's certificate that said circling approach VMC only. And it didn't mean that you flunked circling. It just meant that you could only do it with VMC conditions, which meant 1,000 or 3. And in our op specs, it was actually, if the MDA was higher, of course, you had to be at the higher MDA. So there's a lot to learn from this, as any event. Once again, John and Martha, you guys are the best, and we so much appreciate you taking the time to be part of this program.
Well, I think the
As a
National Association of Flight Instructors is doing a real
yeah,
service.
go ahead.
Pardon, Paul?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, I'm saying that NAFI is doing a real service, providing the venue for analyzing these kinds of things, because I think the long run solution for the general aviation community is to teach people how to identify and mitigate risks, and be proactive about risks instead of reactive. And that's what we're suggesting here is way ahead of this trip. Think about what the risks are and how you're going to mitigate.
Well, my mentor and longtime friend who not only taught me to fly, but also was instrumental in teaching me to be an instructor. He said, always expect the unexpected. And if you have that mindset, then it will set you up for coming up with an alternative and coming up with plans. Again, folks, if you like these programs and you're not a member of NAFI, we really encourage you to join. Take Wings credit. It's a easier process. If you want to make a donation through our educational foundation, please feel free to do that. This will be the 56th broadcast. We have the rest of them archived. We broadcast these on the third Wednesday of every month at 8 p.m. And the next one will be presented by Captain Brian Schiff and Mark King, Understanding Slips and Skids. So please tune in June and join us for broadcast number 57. Once again, I want to thank our sponsor, David Clark, for their support of this program. We appreciate their help very much. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.